The integrated Vaal river system is the backbone of the economy of Gauteng as the economic hub, not only of South Africa, but the entire African continent. Leading industries that breathe life into our country's economy, such as Sasol and Eskom, are supplied with water from the Vaal river system. The South African Water Chamber recently ran a very interesting poll on whether or not the Vaal river system should be privatized or not. And those results were interesting. So stay with us, don't go away. We will be right back. If you are just joining us, welcome to the Water Hour. I'm your host, Bridgetti Limbanda from Cape Town in South Africa, and our live stream is brought to you by BeLive Media and the South African Water Chamber. Now, this is an audience-centric show, and we are monitoring the comments. So whether you're watching us over on Facebook, on Twitter, on LinkedIn, or over on YouTube, please feel free to post your comments and questions to our panelists. So if you've just joined us, we're talking about the integrated Vaal river system, which is the backbone of the economy of Gauteng and also the economic hub, not just of South Africa, but the entire African continent. And the conversation today is around whether or not this should be privatized or not. Our panel today comprises of Benoit Leroy, Fred Platt, and Dr. Anthony Turton of the South African Water Chamber. So let's dive into this conversation. Gentlemen, welcome, and glad to have you here. And I think what I'm going to just quickly share, Benoit, I'm going to start with you to ask you to just give us some background as to why we are having this conversation, why it's so important, and then we'll also just show what the results were of a poll that you recently ran on LinkedIn, and why we thought that this would be a good conversation. So over to you.
Thanks, Bridgetti, and hi to our viewers. Let's hope we can make this quite interesting for the first Water Hour of the year. And what sort of prompted the discussion and the topic was that during December we've had in most of the country we've had really good rains in the summer rainfall areas, and we've had some destructive rains to an extent. But what is quite amazing is that Southern Africa has got 90% of its dams full. So not quite the whole SADC region, but Southern Africa. And the integrated Vaal river system went up to 108% recently, and is been running at just below and under 100%. And I found on LinkedIn quite a lot of interest, and also in the TV media, about our water batteries being full. And I've had unprecedented comments, views, and following on this particular issue. And the question that always comes out is, why don't we have water in our taps? Why is the water not clean? Why are we running out in certain areas? Why is the price of water so high? Why have the water tariffs not come down because we've got more water, etc.? And then there's the issue of privatization that crops up. Without going into the definition of privatization, I thought, privatization is an extremely complex and mostly successful in most sectors of service provision all over the world, especially in developing economies. And in South Africa, we have a limited amount of quasi-privatization in various things. And in the energy side, Sasol is a very good example of the most successful privatization I think we've had. We could say on the steel side with Mittal, it's a little less successful, but it is successful, nevertheless. But, privatization is a word that's bandied about, and it's a lot more complex. And what I thought is, service provision is really the symptom of let's say governance issues, pricing issues, and let's say policy issues. But when we look at resource management and the integrated Vaal River system being really the heart of central South Africa's water security, is in actual fact, in my opinion, fairly well managed. In most people's opinion, not well managed. And the poll showed that 71% believe that specifically the integrated Vaal River system should be privatized. That means taken away from the hands of government and put into private ownership. And there's really very few people who have access to this except for government, and government holds all the cards in this particular area. And if we privatized that, should we privatize the rest of the water resources? So I thought, let's put a poll and let's see that, because about 3 or 4 years ago, National Business Institute did a very well scientifically carried out poll in South Africa's populace, and roughly 61 or 62% believed that privatization of water in South Africa as a general topic was not to be done. And here, amongst LinkedIn being more, let's say, especially our networks of professionals across a whole spectrum of disciplines, and here it's overwhelming. 71 that specific catchment area should be privatized. Didn't do another poll to say should it be extended to the rest of South Africa. Did this as a start to maybe delve and debate and discuss into the topic and see what my colleagues think and what people think. So I thought it would be a very good discussion to start the year with, and definitely raise the issue of privatization, but also the issue of government management and the issue of full dams versus poor service provision. So yeah, I think that's it from my side.
I think that's a good way to just get us started and just kick off the conversation here. So thanks very much for that introduction, Benoit. I think I'm going to start off the conversation by asking, what is water privatization and what is the alternative? Perhaps, Anthony, would you like to take that question?
Yeah, I was actually hoping Fred would answer that one. I'd like to deflect it in, but I'll give it a go. I think. Okay, let me first start off by saying that privatization in general in the South African environment is highly politicized, and it's generally seen as a negative thing. You must remember that South Africa is awash with an ideological discourse that plays out at every conceivable level. And central to that ideological discourse is the notion, the socialist belief that the state should control all of the resources in society. And of course, within that milieu, capital and private enterprise is largely seen as the enemy, to be controlled at best, to be vanquished if at all possible. And this lies very much at the heart of our inability to create jobs at the moment, because what capital would be willing to go into that environment. So we need to be very careful how we talk about privatization. I don't think we mean by privatization putting the control of water into the hands of a free market economy where people can make profits off it. This is not what privatization is about. But for me, the best example of thinking about privatization is to take a bottle of beer, and you will find that the beer distribution will go into the poorest neighborhood of the country and will sustain the supply in that neighborhood, and at a price where the consumer is willing to buy. So we can learn a lot from that. So is there profit made of that? Yes, of course, there's some return on that investment. Is it excessive? Well, the people are quite prepared to pay for the service and the product. And then, of course, we need to understand what is the alternative if we don't have water. So if we come into this thing from the perspective that water is an economic enabler, which is the position taken by the water chamber, then, of course, if we provide water at a fair price, in a reliable way, at a consistent pressure of a predictable quality, then of course we can now start having all sorts of economic activities. So the question now is, at what point in time can we reintroduce private sector thinking, private capital into the value chain of water, but not necessarily to privatize it as in, for example, producing high-end bottled water for the rich and excluding the poor. It's not about that at all. So we just need to contextualize this conversation. One can go into greater depth about that, but of course, one of the important things that I would just like to add at this point in time is that once one talks about some element of private sector participation, we bring into the equation a piece of legislation that does not apply to municipal management. And that is a very important piece of legislation because we start talking about the Companies Act, and the Companies Act holds executives in fiduciary positions personally responsible and criminally liable if they do something that's untoward with that money. This is something that you do not find in the Municipal Financial Management Act, and this is something that is missing. And until we get that fixed up, of course, we are not going to overcome the very big ugly C word that we deal with in South Africa, which is corruption.
Thanks very much for that perspective, Anthony. Fred, can we ask you to give some input there from a business perspective on the alternative to privatization of water?
Yeah, thank you very much, Brigitte. It's quite an interesting debate and I think a debate that we need to engage with because we have such ideological positions on this particular issue, as Tony says. So, I think firstly the poll is clearly an indication that people are losing confidence in government's ability to address the water crisis as it stands. And that then leads into a position that is in that poll quite dualistic. So either it's privatization or it's government ownership. And I think at this point in time, there is very little confidence that under government control and management that this issue will be effectively addressed. On the other hand, we have a situation where people have a lot of fears around the issue of privatization. What does that mean? And I think Tony has addressed it, and I think Benoit has addressed it. Does it mean that all of a sudden now we will make sure that there's a profit motive just driving the provision of water? And does that mean that only the rich will have access? And et cetera, et cetera. Now, within the South African context, we know that water is the ultimate economic enabler. So the first thing we need to do is understand that the provision of water aids the developmental state, creates employment, is an economic enabler, and for that reason is a critical component. So privatization as a word has certain reactions as nationalization has. So people react when you put this out, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, because I think that we need a robust discourse around what is happening in the water sector. So if we look at the current scenario, the question is, does government on its own have the capability and the capacity to deliver? And secondly, does it have the finance to deliver? And if those two are not fully present, given the looming crisis that we have, then we must agree that there's got to be some private involvement or participation within this process. And I think that's really where the discourse should be taking place, is what is that relationship and what is that point between government and the private sector. Now, interestingly enough, if we look at some of the leading, if I can call them water economies in the world, water is viewed as a national asset. So whether that be in Israel or whether it be in Singapore or whether it be in the UAE or in any of those. So in those, although we have great private participation within those economies, the water asset is still a national asset. And so that for me is really where I think our debate should be taking place.
Thanks for that input, Fred. Benoit, would you like to take that question from Alison? She asks, what would be the advantages and benefits of privatization for everyday South African citizens? How will it improve water security service delivery as a whole for South Africa?
Yeah, thanks for that, Alison. Firstly, 59% of households don't pay for water. So can you imagine 59% of households not paying for their cellular phone bills, not paying for their quart of beer, etc., etc.? It cannot work. So, at the moment, we don't have water security. That's very clear. We also have very disincentivized investors from an energy, labor, and water perspective. You can sort out the other two. Don't sort out the water. Your investors will not come in. And we know that this is one of the biggest issues. Investors want sustainable security in basic services, be they local, continental, or international investors. So it's not working at the moment, and that's very clear. If you look at our mines, all of our gold, platinum, coal, etc., is a national resource, and you get a license to mine it, okay, on behalf of South Africans who own it, and you make a profit out of it, and you compete because the globe decides what the price is, a supply and demand story. And the globe decides what the price of that mineral actually is. When it comes to water, at the moment, the way of sorting out California's problems is in actual fact through trading it through a stock exchange, as they've done in the Darling River Basin in Australia. And what happens is the water hasn't changed hands. It's still a national resource. It is highly regulated, but freely traded on a capitalistic basis. And those countries, we can say what we want, they thrive. Okay. And they thrive very well. So if you look at the integrated Vaal River system, which happens to be full at the moment, which hasn't been for 8 or 9 years or 10 years, those are sort of the cycles. And we still have water restrictions in Gauteng at the moment because there's not enough water on a sustainable basis. And with climate change, we have double evaporation that we used to have. So we're also storing water the wrong way. That's another discussion. So a water use license gives you access, like a miner does for his resource, for his mineral. It gives you access to water for a period of time, okay, on a sustainable basis. And it's left at that. There's no competition in the system. And we can say what we want. In nature, there's competition. So if we were able to stoke the economy through a vibrant water market, attract investment, all of a sudden we would have maybe 90% or 95% of households paying for the water. You need to pay for it. There's no such thing as free water. And I am not able to pay more for the poor. I can't. Okay. Most of us are in that same position. Right? We're paying 30 Rand a kiloliter, and we throttled our use right down, which puts the price up, even more. So we need to get more people into the water market, paying for it in an affordable manner. Okay, different qualities of water, and we need private sector to compete in using, so having access to a water use license for that resource for a finite period of time, so they invest. And those periods of time are normally 10 to 20%, 10 to 20 years. In South Africa, it's limited to 20. Some countries go to 30. And you have competition because you cannot tell me that the breweries or the mobile networks do not compete, do not make profit, they do not provide a reliable service. They do. For water, it's no different. And the United Nations is very clear that everybody has the right to security, to healthcare, to water, to access to water and food. It never says for free. And since South Africa provided water for free, our water security disappeared. And I remember that day when President Mbeki announced it. We folded a 4 billion rand program for the poor because they could not pay for the running costs. So we have to change that game, but to change the game, we have to do it in a highly regulated, like our financial services are highly regulated. The communication sector is highly regulated. And we need to regulate the water sector independently, and it's in the NIP 2050. So that is going to happen, but it hasn't happened yet. It's supposed to start in April or May this year, start phasing that out. But a highly regulated, capitalistic approach to the water market is no different to the food. Now, our food, we all have a right to access to food and the likes, but the thing is, some people are starving, some people don't have the calories, okay? But what happens is everybody pays for their food, and certain things are not, VAT on them and likes. We need to approach the very same thing with water, in that it costs money to build dams, to manage dams. It costs money to build purification plants, to build bulk lines, to transfer it to the municipalities. And somebody's got to pay for that. And the less you pay for it, I think my connection's so good. So security is not good. And we need to have private sector participation, which is in the NIP 2050. It is accepted. The question is, to what extent, do we do that? And to what extent can we attract private sector participation that's sustainable, so that we can change the water security situation?
Thanks very much for that, Benoit. Benoit, I'm just wondering, can you just refresh your screen and see if we can get a better connection there? And then, Anthony, can I ask you, unless you wanted to comment on that, but I also wanted to ask you, does privatization change the way that cost recovery occurs? Since Benoit did touch on the cost.
Yes, Brigitte, I'll gladly do both of those together. What that previous conversation has done is opened up a debate that I believe we need to have in an honest way in South Africa, and that is, what is the best remedy for the serious poverty we have in the country? Is the best remedy for poverty giving out government grants to the poorest of the poor at levels of value that are so low that I don't know how anyone can frankly survive on it, but it induces a long-term dependence on that government grant? Or the alternative is the best solution to poverty creating enough jobs that can pay fair market wage for a fair, honest job done in a regulated environment that's also fair, but ultimately giving people the ability to pay for the services that they need to sustain a modern lifestyle. So this is a very, very important debate, and I belong to the latter school of thought, where I believe that we need to create jobs. We need to grow our economy at least at 5% per annum for at least the next decade or two, simply to start employing the people that have been unemployed for the last decade. And unless we do that, then the outcome is not going to be a healthy one. So I'm a firm believer in that approach. Now, I know there are a lot of people that don't like neoliberalism and neoliberal capitalist thinking and all that kind of stuff. That's an ideological discussion. And I would like to just close off by saying that we are seeing playing out before our eyes at global level a great battle between two ideological models, and neither of them have been successful in the long run. On the one hand, you've got the capitalist model, which has resulted in a massive accumulation of wealth by a very, very small number of people, which in and of itself is unsustainable. And just recently, I've seen a conversation by some of the top billionaires of the world that they are saying effectively that government is not taxing their wealth enough. So that's an interesting conversation in its own. And I would say that capitalism, as it's currently structured, is unable to sustain itself and will ultimately fail. But by the same token, we are seeing playing out, certainly in South Africa, an attempt to introduce socialism to our economy, and socialism also, wherever you have seen it, has not had a very successful track record. So we need to get away from capitalism with a C, big capital C, and socialism with a big capital S. And we need to now create this other alternative, which is neither capitalist nor socialist, but a kind of hybrid of the two, a social democracy, where you've got elements of socialism, but that are sustained by a vibrant economy that's regulated, where you've got free access to jobs, where water is available, in the qualities and the quantities that we currently have. And let me just close up by saying that I'm currently down in Port Shepstone area. As we sit here now, we have no water in our taps. We have had no water for a few days now. Parts of Port Shepstone go without water for months on end. I'm currently getting information from East London. East London is the same. So how can this be good for any local economy where the water supply is broken down through a number of factors, and one of them is the non-payment for goods and services? So we are seeing the collapse, the absolute collapse of the system. And I would argue that if we carry on with business as usual, where the state is running the show, I'm afraid the outcome is inevitable and entirely predictable. It's going to be a low job creation, capital flight out the country, unstable political system, and I'm afraid a growing and endemic poverty. So that's the alternative. How can we now turn that thing around by embracing capital in a way that is politically acceptable, but also in a way that enables us to get to the capitalism with a small c, merge with the socialism with a small s. Back to you.
Thanks very much. So I was just reading this comment by Miriam there. Anthony, you were just mentioning that at the current present, at the moment, you are not having water. And Miriam's comment there is also indicative of the issues that we are having. And so I was wanting to just switch to Alison's comment there. She's asking, how does government feel about the idea of privatization? And that ties in very much with what we discussed earlier. What is the alternative? Fred, would you like to take this one?
Yeah, thanks, Brigitte. The problem we've got, as I mentioned, is as much an ideological problem or a problem around the lexicon. So when you talk about privatization, it brings up certain perceptions that it's a total free market that has no regulation or no boundaries. And on the other hand, when we talk about government control, then we have the same. So I think what we're talking about here is a bunch of stakeholders. So I think it's important to understand that we collectively, government, the private sector, and the people at large are staring into the face of a looming crisis. So we need to collectively find a solution that will enable us to turn this crisis into an opportunity that can be the catalyst for economic growth within the country. So I think that government is quite aware that it requires two things from the private sector. One is the capacity that's required in order to execute, and secondly, the financial support in order to do that. Now, that would require, so if we look at the economies that have managed that, and I always, I look at countries like the United Arab Emirates that are in the middle of the desert, dry countries with very little, but government understood that water is the ultimate economic enabler. When you invest in that, you open up a whole host of other opportunities. And today, if you go to Dubai, you see a thriving city, country, same in Singapore, etc. So I'm of the opinion that we need to kind of find a new lexicon that addresses the fears of business, addresses the fears of government, gets away from our ideological past, as Tony has says, the big C and the big S, and we find that middle ground that allows private capital to invest into the economy alongside government creating the enabling environment that will ultimately see the economy thrive. And I think that is the debate that really is currently taking place and needs to be escalated between government and the private sector. And that is what does government need to do to provide an enabling environment for private sector to participate in order to achieve the outcomes. And I think we've got a number of examples. You know, Benoit mentioned some earlier. For me, you know, Sanral, forget the e-tolls, but many of our roads are privately operated for the state, very successfully so. And so the model is already there. It's just a question of how do we now take it and adapt it and implement it within the water sector.
Thanks very much for that, Fred. Can we talk a bit about the financial costs of water, and what are the costs, benefits, or differences between public and privatized water? Who would like to take that? Benoit? Anthony?
So if you look at the UK in the 1980s, I think it was Margaret Thatcher who shook the tree there, because basically the UK's infrastructure was in the state ours was. And they did not have, and I think in those days it was something like £40 billion was needed to rejuvenate their water and wastewater infrastructure. They didn't have the money. So they went to full privatization hog. And in a mature economy, I think you can do that a lot easier. The result is that they don't have 50% non-revenue water, they have 4%. Okay. And that's the target they drive to. They don't all get it. But the CO7 Trent, I think it is 2 years ago, forced to resign because he didn't meet that KPI that year. So the price of water is the topic we need to start off. The baseline is that it's underpriced worldwide. So what happens is we get under recoveries, and that's why we get under investment. And in South Africa, we have very expensive water. We have big dams. In Europe, they don't have big dams like we do. We have interbasin transfers. Don't have that in Europe. Okay. Even in the US, there's a limited amount. The big interbasin transfers, the way I understand it, is in China. Okay. Who still run out of water. But, you know, so if you look at, we're not putting enough money into the water. If you don't have water, we have no economy, we have no dignity, we have no life. So the first thing is the price of water has to be adjusted. The other thing is we have inefficiencies. We don't have a zero-based costing in this country because the regulator is dysfunctional. So you need to say, where do we start? We have cost increase, also in energy. Okay, and it's put us as one of the most unaffordable energy places in the world, and that's forced a lot of disinvestment. So we need to get the right price of water, and the question is, I believe in a free market, the right price will settle down. Because if you have a look at it, we say, you know, our data is very expensive with mobile networks and all this. Those prices have come down in the last 2 years only because of competition, not because of government. And the regulator has to make sure that the competition is fair. Okay? We still got a way to go. There's no reason why this cannot work in water. And government knows this because the National Infrastructure Plan 2050 talks about private sector participation, private sector funding, private sector skills, private sector operation and maintenance. It's there. But the reality is the master plan was published in 2018, 900 billion rand, and we have not done anything of huge value. So raising the Clan William Dam wall, which is the big project for 4 billion rand in the Western Cape, it's in the same place it was 10 years ago. And believe you me, in 10 years it'll be in the same place because they're trying to do it through the National Construction Company, which doesn't exist, so it doesn't progress. Okay, so we need to have that healthy competition in there. Government is on board. Not everybody in government, but government in general is on board. The NIP 2050 wouldn't have been published if that wasn't the case. And in the NIP 2050, the logistics side, Portnet, Transnet, is going to be privatized, unbundled and privatized to a greater extent than what it has been because it's destroyed our roads and our ports are not competitive anymore. So forget importing, we can't export a lot of our stuff. So I think government is very aware of what needs to be done. And also, just to add, is the Cubans, I don't know if they've left, because we haven't seen any of them, haven't been mentioned. So let's bury that one. I mean, Cuba's running out of its own water. But the new Director General, and I say new because for a decade we didn't have a Director General Water Sanitation. So to me, we've got a master plan. We've got a Director General who's appointed. Yes, he's a civil engineer. He's got a PhD in supply chain management, I think it is. He's an absolute specialist in project finance and in supply chain management. He's been in the state for quite a while. He was involved with DBSA in looking at private sector participation for the water funding before this appointment. So now we don't have Hollywood in the department. We've got a permanent placement. We don't have anybody acting in there. So to me, that's a really, really good sign. The NIP 2050 will be approved and gazetted very soon. And we're going to do 900 billion in 2018 money from this year to hopefully 2028. So we're going to do a lot more than 100 billion a year because we have to catch up. Until we finish that, unemployment will just increase. So we have to do that catch up. And I think, we're heading in the right place. So we just have to bring all these plans, all these gazettes, all these permanently appointed people and herd them into one direction and get going. And the private sector's got the money. That we know. We just want the T's and C's to be reasonable and conducive. So I think we're there. And in that whole equation, what we are doing is we are privatizing on a selective basis to get competition into the water market so that we can get the best deals. And there will be some tough times and some feathers ruffled, I believe, on the way. But the regulator that we've been fighting for half a decade now will be key in making sure, so the referee, that the game is fairly played. And I think that's very important. And we've seen that not all our regulators are able to do that. So we've got to beef it up. But we have the ability to do it. And I believe that great things are going to happen with the independent water regulator. A lot of people don't like more regulation and all this. You have to, because humans don't play by the rules. So we have to make the market play by the rules. And we decide what the rules are as a society.
Yeah, Brigitte, can I just add on to that, please? There was mention made of raising dams. I just want to bring a bit of a KZN perspective to it. There's been serious water scarcity around the northern part of Durban, the Brita Bay area, and there's been a dam raising effort there, Hazelmere Dam, under the auspice of the government for some time now. Now that dam has not, the dam raising effort has stalled. It's got budget overruns of, I don't know, 100%. I don't know what the exact numbers are, but something in that order. They've not finished the project. And why? Because too many people are just dipping their fingers into these large amounts of money that are being thrown around. So if you look at this notion that the government must pay for all of these things, well, let's take a bite of the reality sandwich. The government ain't got no more money, baby. It's finished. It's gone. The revenue streams have dried up. The fiscus has been bled dry. So I live in the Port Shepstone area, and they're talking here now about a 2 billion rand bailout that they're going to get in the near future. Well, where's that going to come from? Government doesn't have that money. And I'd just like to mention, Benoit spoke about Maggie Thatcher privatizing in her tenure. Well, let me talk from a communist perspective. The reason why the USSR imploded in 1989 was the inability of the fiscus to sustain state-owned enterprises, period. Finished and klar. That is why the USSR no longer exists. So yeah, we can do the communist stuff and we can repeat the same old exercise here again, because that's exactly what we're doing here. We are following the USSR model, and we are at the point now where we're about to implode just as the USSR did. We cannot, the fiscus, the tax-paying public, is simply unable and increasingly unwilling to foot that bill. So now we're in a situation, I'm going to ask another question now. What is government and who is government? When we talk about government, who is government? We've got a deeply divided political system, a profoundly divided ruling party with different factions. So which faction are we talking about now? And that's the big power struggle. Is it the RET faction that wants to gain control? Well, of course, they are going to be completely opposed to any form of privatization, because then they lose control over the flow of cash. And that's not in their interest. but what is the collective best interest for the people of South Africa? And I think that's the other faction of the ruling party that we want to engage with, because what is best for the people of South Africa is viable jobs, a life of dignity, the capacity to earn an honest living in a fair way, to live a dignified life, to not have to live on handouts being given by other people. So this is a part of that bigger debate. And I believe between now, the municipal election that we had last year, and the forthcoming general election, I believe that what we're talking about now is going to be playing out, because these are like two brackets. The opening bracket was the municipal election. The closing bracket is going to be the national election. And what happens between now and then is going to determine who's going to drive the ship after the next election. And it's going to be a very different space to what we're in now. So what we are doing now is we are brainstorming the future. And it might sound far-fetched because our mindset is based on the here and now. And our mindset is based on this fictitious notion that the government must provide all the jobs and the government must do everything. Well, the government has shown us that they're unable to do it. So if we go into the argument about the cost of water, so what is the current cost of water? Is it high? Is it low? And if for those that are not paying, the current cost of free water is not having access to water. That's the price of free water. So, we have to get into this thing in a realistic way. There is nothing free in the world. You don't pay for the water, you pay for the reliability and the service. And I'll just mention here 6 things that comes with water security, because we're losing all 6 of those things. 6 things in water security is a guarantee of a given volume of water at a given quality, at a given pressure, at a given price, in a given time, and a given space. Those are the guarantees of water. That's what gives us water security. Right now, we've got this ironic situation where our national dams are 90% full. The Vaal river system is 100+% full. But right now, Mfuleni, as what used to be our industrial heartland, is collapsing at an accelerating rate because industries are unable to get energy, they're unable to get water in a sustainable way, they're unable to attract capital to recapitalize the system. So right next door to it, in the very streets of Vereniging, water's flowing around like a river. And yet they haven't got water to flush the toilets, or the sewage works are broken down. So this is the ironic thing. How do we close that loop, and how do we ultimately start talking the only game that should be in town, and that is how do we create jobs? How do we create an inclusive economy with natural organic growth within the economy that's not artificially stimulated through stimulus measures, but the ability to grow that economy on its own? That's what we should all be aiming for. Inclusive growth, dignified employment, and sustainable economic growth. And I know some people on the left don't like the idea of a growing economy, of the need to grow the economy. I will nail my colours to the mast. Show me the country in the world that doesn't have economic growth and that also doesn't have problems. Unfortunately, the way our consumptive behaviours are predicated at the moment in the world is we've got to have some form of economic growth simply to absorb the natural population growth. And unless we can get smarter doing this, even if we do get smarter doing this, the net result of that is more unemployment, because smart technologies create joblessness. So we can slice and dice this any way we want to. How do we create economic growth? How do we create jobs through attracting capital back into South Africa? And we believe in the Chamber that the water is this economic enabler. And we believe that this R1 trillion that we've got to raise to recapitalize the Chamber, that is the R1 trillion that's going to have the multiplier of, let's say, a four times multiplier. That now becomes R5 trillion slushing around the economy. Okay, this is the kind of thing that we can start talking about realistically. It's not about trying to make a fast buck out of selling some rich people exotically labeled sparkling water. It's not about that at all. It's about how do we get back to those 6 things: guarantee of a given volume water, a given pressure, a given price, a given quality, a given time, a given place. And that's what it's all about. It's about service level agreements between the municipality as the end consumer, as the user, as the distributor. It's about where they get their water from, an independent water producer, and the service level agreements that they put in place there. That if this producer is unable to meet those 6 criteria, then they've failed in their contract. Then penalties kick in, and then they ultimately lose their license to operate. So, this is where that regulated environment that Benoit speaks about so eloquently. So all of the solutions are there. We have the solutions. And between these two brackets that I spoke about now, this is where we've got to frame that conversation. And we've got to really get this on the agenda by the time the national election takes place, because this is an absolutely bread and butter issue that I think will become one of the key elements in the next national election.
You're on mute, Brigitte.
Thanks very much, Benoit. Fred, can I ask you to take this next question from Alison, and then Benoit, can I ask you for a comment on that as well? So the question is, who would regulate the private sector, keep them accountable and moving in the same direction and on course with deadlines in securing water in South Africa?
Thanks, Brigitte. I think a wonderful question. I think we cannot go from the assumption that the private sector will adequately regulate themselves. I think the Zondo Commission has shown us that that doesn't necessarily happen. And that's why we as a chamber have been, campaigning for an independent regulator for quite a while. That would set the rules and hold people accountable. I think we need to enter into an era of accountability, whether it is government or whether it is the private sector. We as the public and an engaged citizenry need to hold all of those parties accountable in the delivery of service. So the primary framework is already in place in terms of the relevant legislation. We're now looking at the independent regulator, and then we're looking at a contracting framework that would address exactly the questions that Alison has raised. But ultimately, we as the public also have a huge responsibility in not only holding our elected officials to account, but also in holding business and the private sector accountable.
Indeed. Benoit, can we ask you for a comment on that?
Yeah. So if you look at it at the moment, the current architecture is that you have the policy maker, the custodian of water, the manager of bulk water resources and dams, and the producer of bulk water through the water boards. They're utilities, but they're really water boards because they're government owned. That the single shareholder is the Department of Water Sanitation, and that is the regulator. So it's actually farcical because now you're asking the producer to regulate itself, and that's why it doesn't work. And the budget's 550 million rand a year, and it's a lot of money. So an independent water regulator would be legislation is passed that forms its constitution, the way it operates. The people are recruited in an open and transparent manner, not catered deployment. And we're going through that phase now to rid ourselves of that problem. And what happens is that it may well report to the ministry or to the presidency or to parliament, etc. But the thing is, the country of South Africa agrees to the legislation. That goes through our parliament. That's the way democracy works. And the framework, like all other regulators, and some do work better than others. Our energy one, we know is a problem, okay? But it's infiltrated. That's the problem. But we'll sort that problem out. But the concept works. And so the regulator will not be part of the policy making or the producer and the owner of the biggest utilities. So we've got to separate. That's why we put that word in, independent. So that gets separated. Now you have a referee who is far less biased than the current situation. And, ideally, these Chapter 9 institutions should report to Parliament, but I think it's going to take a while to get that maturity of thinking in there, like the Public Protector and the likes. And it doesn't stop it from being captured, but it makes it more difficult. But we need to just separate that out. And believe me, the private sector will not participate if there isn't policy certainty, contracting certainty, and regulatory certainty. And that's not a South African thing. That's a global thing. Nobody puts their money into an open pit where there is no chance of a return. So that's why government has decided to stop fighting that. And in actual fact, it's in the NDP, National Development Plan, that sits right at the top of all of this, which is national water security. And that's it. And the National Development Plan commissioners report to the presidency. Now, one could say that's centralization, and that's not good. What it does, though, it takes it out of the grasp of the ministries, who are quite incapable at the moment. And the presidency has a better chance of trying to manage that process. It's not ideal, it's probably temporary. So the independent water regulator is absolutely crucial, and it looks like from mid-2050 will be the first thing that's put in place, okay, with the National Implementation Agency, so that we can start talking, getting done. I know the Development Bank of South Africa, which is also state-owned, but it's of Southern Africa, is working very hard in using generic World Bank private sector participation models and all the like, but to unfold it, we need the independent water regulator. So all of these things are happening simultaneously at the moment, and I'm quite optimistic that we will see a lot of this happening in first half of the year, at least starting to get traction, so the talk shops stop and the action shops start taking place. We'll definitely push as hard, and we are pushing as hard, and there's dialogue at the moment.
Thanks very much for that, Benoit. Anthony, can you also touch a bit more on the role of regulation and why that's important?
Yes, to me, the essence of that conversation is the fact that we've demonstrated over the last 2 decades that the government department called Water Affairs or Water and Sanitation is unable to be both player and referee. It simply has demonstrated its inability. If DWS was successful as a regulator, then no municipality would have become financially embarrassed. No municipality would have a water infrastructure that has totally failed if they were a successful regulator. So that has failed. We've demonstrated quite clearly that it cannot work. But we do need a regulator, and the Business Chamber has been directly involved in this matter with OUTA. We've been lobbying aggressively in some parallel channels for some period of time now to get this notion of a water regulator put on the table. Unless we get a water regulator, we are not going to have a snowball's hope in hell of ever attracting the 1 trillion rand that we need to recapitalize the water sector. So it is a necessary condition for the recapitalization of the water sector. And once we get that water chamber, that water regulator, independent water regulator, they are the people that then effectively don't have a direct vested interest in a given outcome, but they have been given a mandate to provide water at a certain. Remember those 6 things I spoke about? Those 6 things. A certain volume, certain pressure, certain price, a certain quality at a given time and a given place. That's what their mandate is, and they set targets for that period of time. And the suppliers that cannot meet those mandates simply don't get their license. The license gets revoked. So we create more certainty in the investment environment, but also more certainty for the general Joe Soap, the general citizen that is currently living under this cloud of collapse of water security. How can you run a household when you are uncertain that you're going to have water to flush the toilet or to wash your vegetables with tomorrow? And that's what it's become in many parts of the country. If you extrapolate that upwards, how can you run an economy when you're setting up a factory that's going to employ 1,000 people when they are unable to get their water? Or if you need that same water to produce steam or to flush out systems or for industrial processes, we need to solve those problems, and they're not insurmountable problems. It all ultimately comes down to a regulatory certainty, which is a government issue, and then it also comes down to policy certainty. At the moment, we don't have policy certainty. And let me just mention something, just to put a number on the table here now. South Africa ran out of water in 2002. We simply don't have enough water since then. In 2002, we became a water-constrained economy. If we are going to use current available technologies and taking the current conversion ratios of a unit of water to a unit of labor or to a unit of employment, we need approximately 63 billion cubic meters of water by 2030, 2035, around about there. We currently have available 39 billion cubic meters. That's what the total volume of all our dams is. So if we go down this policy certainty route now, then we have effectively got a shortfall of 25 billion cubic meters, which is approximately 2/3 of the total volume of all the water in all our dams that we have got to mobilize in the next decade. This is a huge stimulus package. This is something on the Marshall Plan scale of operations. This is the kind of thing that can rejuvenate our economy. Not a small little Mickey Mouse poultry thing. We're talking about something very, very big here, because that's the only way that this thing can succeed, is to be big, to be bold, to be focused, to have credible people in the driving chair, but more importantly, a very, very robust regulatory environment that prevents the state capture thing that we've had up to now, and that delivers a fair service to the tax-paying citizens of this country and to the ordinary people that are battling right now in the state of poverty and unemployment.
Thanks very much for that, Anthony. We've almost reached the top of the hour. Can we just have a brief sort of final comment around Robin? Fred, can we start with you, Benoit, and then Anthony for a final comment?
Yeah, I think firstly I'd like to thank everyone, and especially the Water Chamber, Benoit, for putting this out there, because I think we need to have these type of engagements, and we need to have robust debate around what does this model that we are proposing look like, what are the challenges that we potentially face, how do we find that balance between just privatization or nationalization, and how do we find that sweet spot, and that's really where I think that business and government are committed to this. I think it's just a question of now taking the plans that we have developed and how do we turn those into actionable plans. So it's all really about engaging around how do we implement from here going forward.
Thanks very much for that, Fred. Benoit, can we have a final comment from you?
Yeah. So we see two extremes, nationalization and privatization. And to me, I think what's becoming a lot clearer is that in the middle of the road, we have private sector participation and collaboration with government. And so all stakeholders meet in the middle. So I would suggest that the PSP model, because a triple P model it can be on either side. It can be on the far left, far right, or in the middle. But the private sector participation model, it's busy in its embryonic stages, is actually where the solution lies. And it needs to be at a water resource level, at a bulk water level, and at a water service provision or delivery and distribution level. So for me, I think the debate needs to carry on. And we need to have regulatory, contracting, and policy certainty. We're getting there, but we're not there yet, to be able to push the narrative so that we get water security for everybody at a reasonable price.
Thanks very much, Benoit. And Anthony, can we have a final comment from you?
Yes, I thank you for listening to us today, and thanks for giving us the platform for this very important conversation. What I think we're going to start seeing is that your coastal cities and your small towns, all of which are in some form of water-related distress, these places are going to become the crucible in which we're going to start seeing the rollout of this the private sector participation model, PSP model. It's not a privatization model, it's private sector participation model. And I think that's going to start happening in small towns like Harrismith, for example, like Port Shepstone. It's going to start happening in some of the largest cities, Durban, East London, Port Elizabeth, where we're going to start seeing private capital being attracted into the generation of new water. And that new water is going to be a combination of water recovered from waste, in other words, sewage water that's treated to the highest possible standard, and water that is recovered from the ocean or saline sources, as we've had in Witbank for more than a decade now, where water recovered from highly acidic mine sources has become the foundation of water supply in Malahlengi. So this is where it's going to happen. It's the average Joe public is not even going to be aware that it's happening out there, but this is going to start becoming the norm. It's going to bring capital into the economy, and it's going to be delivered through the special purpose vehicle type of arrangements that we've been working on for some period of time, because that's where we start plugging in the holes in the Municipal Financial Management Act that has enabled so much corruption to embed itself in the economy. It's not going to be an easy straight line from point A to point B. There are many vested interests that want to continue controlling the flow of funds that come out of the fiscus at the moment. So we must never be naive to expect that we're not going to get pushback. But I think let's call it the moderate middle, the average citizen, irrespective of color, race, or creed, simply is up to their eyeballs now in frustration and anger. They need better, they deserve better, they're going to demand better. And that's going to come in this privatization or this PSP model that we're talking about now, mostly as an independent service provider in small towns, where effectively the water provision is going to be provided by special purpose vehicle, contracted into the municipality and using the current municipal network, just basically supplying water as an independent supplier, or through these utility scale bulk water treatment plants that are going to come out of desalination processes, where you get sort of 100 megaliter a day kind of capacity that's going to be brought into the system. And that's what's going to make up that 25 billion cubic meters by the year 2030. That is a substantial market. That alone can attract a significant amount of capital and expertise back into the country. And I would even go so far as to say that unless we do that, we're not going to create the jobs that we need, because we're simply not going to create the capital back into the country, and government can't print capital. If they do, then we become a Venezuela. So, that's my closing statement.
Thanks very much for that, Anthony, much appreciated. If you have just joined us, you have missed the water hour. We were talking about integrated Vaal River system and whether or not that should be privatized. Thank you for joining us. And if you missed it live, you are welcome to watch this on the replay. Leave your comments and questions for our next episode of the Water Hour. For now, thank you very much for joining us. Stay well, stay safe, and we'll see you on the next Water Hour.